Hi everybody, I'm Ryan Chandler. Here's your talking points for this week. Could tragedy in Texas turn the tides in Washington? How about Austin? Our West Texas representatives will decide what changes, but our teachers are the ones who will live with those decisions. We'll sit down with the Texas State Teachers Association to hear how they think things should change and take an inside look at the politics and policy following Uvalde. And a new city council means new ideas for our city streets. This time, they're leaving it up directly to us. We'll hear from the city on how they plan to give us a plan that they can get through voters this November.
From the studios of KAMC Television in Lubbock, your local election headquarters. This is Talking Points with Bryan Mudd.
Thanks for being with us. The eyes of the nation are once again on Texas after the tragedy in Uvalde reignites the debate over gun violence prevention. Texans are leading the conversation over how to protect the would-be victims of the next mass shooting. Senator John Cornyn is presiding over the Senate's negotiations. All signs now point to a modest incremental package.
In order to deliver results, we have to build consensus, and the best way to do that is through targeted reforms.
I think a focus on mental health and criminal background history is probably going to be the most productive.
Right now, those reforms include incentives for states to implement red flag laws that would allow the states to remove firearms from people that a court deemed dangerous to themselves or others, amending background checks to access juvenile records. Remember, the shooters in Buffalo and Uvalde were just 18. And allocating more funding for school security and mental health care. But it will not touch universal background checks or an increase to the minimum age to buy firearms. But those are just the changes that Uvalde's own Matthew McConaughey is calling for. He's been leading the White House's moral argument this week, spending the week in Washington, meeting with senators in both parties and sharing the stories from his hometown at the White House.
We heard from so many people, right? Families of the deceased, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, Texas Rangers, hunters, Border Patrol, and responsible gun owners who won't give up their Second Amendment right to bear arms. And you know what they all said? We want secure and safe schools, and we want gun laws that won't make it so easy for the bad guys to get these damn guns.
And in state government's response, our local representatives are leading the charge. House Speaker Dade Phelan tapped our Dustin Burrows to lead the House Investigative Committee and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, including our state Senator Charles Perry, on their special committee to, quote, protect all Texans. But these special committees are likely in lieu of a special session. So here is where we stand on any legislative response to Uvalde. First, lawmakers must return to the Capitol for the 88th session on January 10th. After that, they have 60 days to file bills, none of which can move through the process until March. You can imagine any bill substantive enough to create any meaningful change would likely carry a significant amount of controversy and debate. That could well take until the late hours of the session to pass. That session ends on May 29th, and each bill has a default effective date of 91 days after the adjournment. That would be August 28th. So if none of that changes, we're looking at another 15 months and an entire school year before a letter of the law changes in response to Uvalde. For more on this, we turn to the preeminent Texas Capitol insider, the editor of the Quorum Report and host of the #1 political podcast in the great state, Mr. Scott Braddock. Scott, welcome back to Talking Points.
Morning, Ryan. Great to see you.
You have said before that these special committees probably hint to the fact that there will not be a special session. So right now we are looking at going into an entire new school year without a single letter of the law changing in response to Uvalde. But just this week we saw 11-year-olds tell Congress that they are scared to go back to school now in lieu of new legislation. What else can the state do in order to make some kind of change, whether it's executive power or another lever of government that we have at our disposal in order to reassure that kids can be safe in August?
One thing to make clear is that if the governor does not exercise his power to call a special session of the legislature, then the only other things that would be available are his executive authorities. And, there are things that he can do unilaterally. As you know, he's directed the Texas Education Agency and some other agencies to do different things, check up on security at different school districts all around the state, do some random checks. And somebody even made the joke that he was calling for universal background checks on doors at schools to make sure that those are safe, even though we know that wasn't completely the issue down in Uvalde. And of course, one of the things that's difficult to evaluate with the shooting in Uvalde is that, and Ryan, you've watched all this, you've covered it, every 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, there's something about the story that changes, and not just changes it in a dramatic way, but in a completely different direction, right? We have seen information come out that completely contradicts what the story had been, just in the day or two before, and that keeps happening with this situation. So that makes it difficult to assess what should be done going forward. But yeah, you're right. As long as they don't call a special session, which again, only the governor can do that, all of the laws in Texas will stay the same. And I'm not sure that's going to be politically sufficient. You have parents all over the place who are Republicans and Democrats alike who would like to see things change. And I'll tell you, as you visit with people around the state in all parts of Texas, a lot of folks aren't necessarily sure what they want done exactly. They would say that's leadership's, responsibility to come up with what ought to be different, but they do want things to change.
There is a lot of conflicting information to parse through. That seems to be the priorities for the committees in each respective chamber now. And West Texas seems to be punching above its weight with these committees. We have Dustin Burrows leading the House investigation, Charles Perry on the Senate Special Committee. What do you think it says about their tenure in the legislature that got them those positions? We asked both of them to come on and talk about that. They want to wait until the investigation is complete. What do you think the role that they will play is on these committees?
We'll watch it closely. I mean, Chairman Burrows and Senator Perry, both, as you said, are in key positions on this, but it does sort of turn into a sort of a quasi-prosecutorial thing, right, where they are seeking the facts and trying to figure out wherever the facts go to then try to come up with some recommendations or some policy prescription for what ought to happen next at the legislative level. And of course, as has been said previously, and we started to talk about it just now, it does seem like to a lot of people that it's a delay tactic so that you don't see new laws anytime soon on guns or on anything else that Republican leadership has pointed to with these school shootings, including mental health, including the actual safety of the classrooms and the campuses. So nothing going to change on that. But as far as their roles specifically, they're going to be closely scrutinized for whatever they do or don't do during these proceedings. And it's interesting that with the committee that Chairman Burrows is heading up, this Texas House Investigative Committee that's specifically looking into the Robb Elementary school shooting, they do have subpoena power. And so for these law enforcement agencies that have been, in conflict even with each other about what the official story ought to be coming out of Uvalde, they may be hauled in front of lawmakers to answer questions. And some of that, a lot of it will happen behind closed doors. The way that committee would work is that they would call people in front of the committee and they can actually interview folks in executive session. And then the actual official version of the story comes out to those of us in the press and the public after the fact. So there can be sort of a delayed reaction here that, a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now, you get some kind of a report out of what happened at the Robb Elementary School. And if you start to think about the way that plays out politically, if this takes 5 or 6 months, that could absolutely end up happening after the election, which would mean that any consequence from what comes out of that committee report, out of those official findings, it wouldn't be in the hands of the voters at that point.
Right, 6 months we're looking at well after the election and right before the next session. So national eyes are looking at this. Of course, we had Matthew McConaughey at the White House briefing room yesterday. He said something that I want to read to you to see if you agree with. He said, this time it seems that something is different. There is a sense that perhaps there is a viable path forward now. When looking at the state response to this, do you agree with that? Do you think that this is a time for change that will get a different response from Texas?
On the state response, as far as the governor and the legislature, as we've been talking about, it seems like they're not going to take any official action until next year. So it's certainly not happening in the moment. And I think for those folks who are looking at this, including Matthew McConaughey and whoever else, and by the way, good on him for speaking out. I was telling some friends yesterday that look, it's actually the first time that he's ever said anything really of substance that you could pin him down and point to a policy position that he's taken. A lot of the things that he said before were just sort of, I would say, pablum. It's sort of, he would try to act as if all sides are to blame for all the problems that we have. And he, by the way, he did say a version of that as well in his comments yesterday. He said that both sides need to sort of rise above the moment and try to grasp some sort of a resolution here, some sort of a policy achievement at the federal level. Although we know, at least as far as gun control is concerned, it is one side that's blocking that. It's the Republicans. Let's be clear about that. So I do have the question for McConaughey as far as whether he's going to call out Republicans if nothing actually happens. I think that needs to be said. But at the same time, when you have those who are pushing for gun control versus those who don't want it, time is always on the side of those who don't want change.
Mr. Braddock, we always appreciate your expertise, and we'll continue to follow your coverage of this. I'll be sure to listen to the latest on the Texas Take this Friday.
Ryan, thank you. Always good to talk.
When we come back, we'll hear from the Texas State Teachers Association on the change that they want to see.
You're watching Talking Points, a focus on the political scene in Lubbock and across the South Plains.
Welcome back. Here's a look at more political headlines from the past week. Well, a new council means new ideas for city streets. Now they're coming directly to us to put forward ideas. They're set to create a Citizens Advisory Committee. Each council member will appoint 1 to 2 citizens from their district to come up with a new plan by August, and they hope send it back to voters this November. And our Lubbock Police Department sent officers down to help Uvalde. They participated in 8 funerals in 4 days, and they remarked on the love and the appreciation that they received from the grieving community.
Going into Uvalde, I honestly wasn't sure what to expect because there is a lot of controversy and things in the media and things that you hear. I didn't know how we were going to be welcomed into the community, and the second that we got there and started to interact with citizens, it was nothing but loving and thankful. Everywhere we went, citizens approached us and hugged us.
And here at home, our school districts are also preparing for the worst. As Lubbock ISD teamed up with first responders to stage active shooter drills this week, the scenes of ambulances and police cars outside Monterey High School were simulated, but no less surreal. KAMC's Landry Senna takes us there.
This is an opportunity for us to come into the most lifelike scenario that we can and practice those responses.
Over 700 volunteers were involved, some acting as role players to make the situations as lifelike as possible while still being as safe as possible. The first half of the exercise was more focused on law enforcement and first responders.
We did 3 different scenarios, one of which was an active shooter that entered the high school. The second was an individual who came in through a propped door and fired shots. And the third was an active shooter during a passing period here in the school.
The second half focused on communication to parents and reunification.
We have students coming in, actors like parents that are pretending to be students coming in on buses, also parents that are showing up to check in to reunify with their child, and so it's as real as we've been able to make it in any of our other practices.
The goal for those responding to these situations is to always find improvements.
We want our families to know that we're going to alert them as soon as possible and keep them informed about anything that may be happening on their child's campus.
Now, this training was scheduled several months ago and is not in response to the recent tragedy in Uvalde. This is something LISD and city officials take very seriously in order to make the right response decisions should an emergency like this take place.
Welcome back, and as our lawmakers decide how to respond to the tragedy in Uvalde, it is our teachers that will have to live with the decisions made for years to come. So for an inside perspective into how teachers are dealing with this and what they hope to see, we turn to Clinton Gill from the Texas State Teachers Association. Mr. Gill, thank you so much for coming on Talking Points.
Thanks for having me.
I just want you to first take us through what the last few weeks have been like since the tragedy in Uvalde, working with teachers and districts around the state. How are they reacting to this?
Well, teachers are just overwhelmed and sad by the entire situation. We never want to have to go through something like this, and unfortunately it seems to be happening more and more. And so we've heard from a lot of teachers since it's happened that they want hardening of the schools wherever they're at in the state and in the nation. And so we're calling on our legislators to do something. We can no longer just talk about it, we've actually got to do something.
Unfortunately, you don't have to go very far back in Texas history to compare this response to the last time this happened. Just 4 years ago at Santa Fe High School, we dealt with a very similar situation. How have you noticed the state's response to the Uvalde shooting compare to what we saw just 4 years ago?
Well, unfortunately, I think we're seeing a lot of the same things. It's put a committee together, find something to say we're going to do, but then we never do it. And so we're strongly suggesting that we can no longer just sit and talk about something. We need the legislators to act, whether that's raising the age for somebody to be able to get an assault weapon like what has been used recently, or some sort of bipartisan measure that can truly impact to where we don't have guns anywhere near. And then we're strongly against arming teachers. That is not the way to go. Teachers have enough on their plates already, and to add that is just nonsense. And so we've got to come up with true action at the legislative level to make things happen.
And that action, you said raising the age to buy a firearm, it is focused in your perspective on the firearms themselves. We've heard conversations from our statewide and national leaders focusing on mental health, on school security. And you know, some of the pundits on the national networks and representatives around the country have even talked about bulletproof backpacks. What do you think when you hear solutions like that that seem to kind of skirt around the edges of the issue?
Yeah, it makes me realize that these people have not been in the classroom. Teachers, like I said, are going through so much already. They deal with mental health on a daily basis. Our kids are coming from home, many of them in lifestyles and homes that are not conducive for good bringing up. And so teachers have oftentimes been the people that have to raise these kids. And so we need more mental health help in the schools. We need legislators to fund that. School districts can no longer, I mean, their budgets are already strapped. And so to say you've got to go put extra money into resources such as mental health and hiring staff without giving them the funding for it is something that we cannot have in the state. We've got to have the true funding from the state level and the federal level to make some changes.
And you really do the work on the ground here in West Texas, working with our local teachers and our districts for the statewide TSTA. Yeah. What have those conversations been like? How are they preparing? I know we saw Lubbock ISD just had their active shooter training. What do you know of the plans for other districts to make sure that we're ready for just 2 months from now in August?
Yeah, so I think school districts are definitely taking a look at how they can harden their school systems right now. Unfortunately, many times it has to go through a bond proposal because schools don't have the money to go and harden their facilities. And so I will say Lubbock ISD is way ahead of the ball game as far as hardening and getting schools in place where it's one secure access point. You have to buzz in to be able to get into a school, but there are many schools across the state that don't have that, and they can't do it unless they get the funding from the state level to actually do it. So we hope that will be coming soon.
This just seems like the last headache that our teachers need. They already go through so much, and every legislative session we have a kumbaya moment surrounding teachers talking about we need to raise their pay, we need to make their lives easier, we need to give them more resources. And then when it comes to something like this, it seems like their voices are not the first at the table. So talking more issues than just gun violence and school shootings, what do you hope to see from the next session to make our teachers' lives easier in all aspects of their work?
Well, obviously, we could save a lot of money by reducing the standardized testing that they force down on kids right now. That's billions of dollars that could be used to harden facilities and provide staff there for mental health issues and things like that. And so there's multiple ways, if they would call on educators to give them some ideas to save some money and utilize that in different ways. And so standardized testing is one of them. Providing pay raises obviously is another thing, but we've got to be able to give these kids the help that they need because, like I said earlier, school is a lot of times where they come for their safe haven because they don't have it at home. And so we can't call on teachers to do any more than they're already doing. We've got to provide support with counselors and things like that that can help them.
Their plate is full.
Yes,
So
most definitely.
yes, they need as much help as they can, unfortunately. I wish it was different, but we appreciate the work that you're doing for them, both here in West Texas and around the state. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Stick around. When we come back, we'll be taking a look at City Hall. Welcome back. We turn now to City Hall. After Lubbock voters rejected the $174.5 million road bond last November, the city wanted to wait for a new council to take another shot. And now it'll ultimately be up to a new Citizens Advisory Committee to decide which streets to repair and with how much money. But the council hopes to send a plan back to voters this November, and that sets them up for a very busy couple of months. So after next week, that group of citizens will get to work on recommendations to present to the council by July 26th.
The answer could easily be all the same, all different, a piece of the same, a piece different, or none. But that's not up to staff. That is really going to be up to these committee members.
And if you want to get involved, the city says the best time to contact your council person is right now. Most of the advisory committee's work will be in public meetings, so follow along and maybe cast your vote on a new plan this November. Stick around, everybody. We'll be right back. And that's your talking points for this week. Send us a comment on our KMAC News Facebook page and at everythinglubbock.com. Click weekly features and talking points to stream this and many of our past shows. That's all of our time. We thank you for watching, and we'll see you right back here next week.